Well, welcome to the show, Stuart. It's wonderful to have you back.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, let's jump right in and happy Friday. I love when we record on Fridays. It's just got the energy, unlike the rest of the week. How's your weekend looking?
I'm going to help my daughter move, so it's
Oh,
gonna be hot and hard, but we're gonna enjoy it.
where's she moving?
She's moving from Austin back to Houston to continue her
Awesome.
education.
Oh, that's wonderful. I have a friend from Poland who's starting at University of Houston, and I'm like,
Oh wow,
Poland can get hot actually,
yeah,
but not like Houston hot. So I hope she's ready.
yeah.
That's
We
exciting. Oh, I bet you're gonna love having her back.
yes, and
Okay,
so will the
cool.
dogs.
Oh, how many?
We have two rescue terriers, and one of
Oh,
them has latched onto her.
oh, then there's that. They're gonna reunite.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
We have a big old sheepdog that thinks she's a lap dog. It's ridiculous.
Well, then she is.
Not on the couch though.
That's
Don't
the way
tell
that
him.
works.
Except in the basement. When I have friends come over, um, I don't know because they're my guests and I let them have the house in the basement and, take it in and relax. And all of a sudden, the dog has been jumping on the couch, jumping on the bed. And I'm like, who is coming over letting this dog on the furniture? And they're like, she's cute. I'm like, she's
Yeah,
80 pounds, not on the bed. But hey, what's what goes on down there, I guess, stays down there.
yeah.
And then the dog comes upstairs like, what? I run this house, whatever. Stuart, it's been a while. I'm so glad you're back on the show. Let's talk about what's new and some fun things that have been happening with you in your world.
Absolutely. So new for me is in June, I published an anthology with Bain Books called Tales of the United States Space Force. And that was
Awesome.
several years in the making, so very exciting to finally get it in bookstores.
But tell us about that. What was the inspiration?
So back in, what was it, 2018, I won the Jim Bain Memorial Award, and you get to go to the International Space Development Conference. I don't know if you've been to that particular conference. I know you've been to some of the other space conferences. But it was in Los Angeles, and it was amazing. I mean, there were people from the Cold War trying to get their old projects back,
Oh
for rail
gosh.
launching materials into space, all the way down to students who had come up with coalitions um, to help other students from around the country get payloads and experiments into space. Very cool stuff. But while I was there, I met Peter Garretson, who was then
Oh,
at the Air Force and Command College. You probably know him. Um, and he was talking about how what he did for the Air Force was basically creating the real Starfleet Command.
mm,
And so we got to talking afterwards. And this was before they created the Space Force in 2018. And I had been on a panel 6 months before that with astronaut Stan Love and with a fellow who worked for the Air Force Space Command about the proposal to create a Space Corps. And I'd learned a
okay.
little bit about it. It was very interesting. We had a nice panel, kind of went on our way. So here I am talking to Peter, and Peter says, "Hey, you're a science fiction author. I've been thinking of putting together an anthology to help promote the Space Force." I said, "What Space Force?" He said, "It's going to happen. The time is right." So we talked about it for a couple of months, and he was seeing the announcement. They started um, uh, announcing the new logo, announcing the new uniform, and social media went crazy. People didn't know. People who didn't like Donald Trump thought that it was his crazy idea.
Oh, Stuart, I'm losing you for
People who
some
didn't know anything.
reason.
Oh,
Hold on. I'm so sorry. Our
yeah,
connection. Here, let me pause. Okay.
right. So here I am at the space conference talking to Peter Garretson, and he finds out I'm a science fiction author, and he said he'd be interested in doing an anthology to kind of promote the News Force. And I said, "What new Space Force?" And he said,
Uh-huh.
"It's going to happen. It's the time has come. They've been talking about this for decades." So we talked about it off and on for a few months, and then he retired from the Air Force, and it kind of went on the back burner until they actually created the Space Force, and I saw the public social media reaction to it, and people thought they had stolen their, their logo from Star Trek and their uniform from Battlestar Galactica, and that it was
Sure.
just people who didn't like Donald Trump thought it was all his idea. And I knew enough about it, and I'm from a military background, and I'm a science fiction writer. I thought, I'm actually looking for a new project. I think
Oh,
I'm the right person to solve this problem for the Air Force, for the Space Force. So I reached out to them. Months went by. I reached out to Bain, and finally, at the next International Space Development Conference, Tony Weinscott, the editor over at Bain, said, "Look, I'll give you the money. Just go do it already."
oh gosh.
So there we go. It
Oh
was
my
just
gosh.
5 years, and
Just right. But it
yeah,
really is
that
all about who you're with, who you're associating with, who you make connections with and network. And especially
it
as a
really
great
is.
writer. Yeah, let's talk about that just a little. I want to hold here when it's I think a lot of people who listen to the show and families, especially and students, they want to understand the great pathways to where we've landed in our careers or in our achievements and milestones. And sometimes there really is no path. It's really a lucky draw, or you've worked so hard to establish yourself, and then the path reveals itself to you, letting you walk through it. But it was previously not there. And it took a conference, a network, a relationship. And that is very hard sometimes to explain or defend or showcase and exemplify for younger people who are like, well, how do I get to Stuart's level? How do I get to be an accomplished writer? How do I get a project like that? Or how can I work with Space Force? And you're like, well, 5 years is not overnight.
That's right. Uh, we have this myth in America of the overnight success, and of course, it almost doesn't exist.
Right.
Invariably, when you check into people's background, there's a long series of things before that overnight occurs.
Oh my
Um,
gosh. For some reason, we are cutting in and out again. Okay. I'm going to pause. Sorry. Okay.
yeah,
We
you're
were just,
absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Early on, I was lucky enough to win the Writers of the Future contest. And in our kind of circle of writer friends, we have a saying that every writer has their own path.
mm,
Um, and the reason of that is that people will contact you. People will devote ridiculous amounts of effort to try and to win contests. And contests are great, but Stephen King never won any contest until after he sold his first novel. So you really have to focus on your building your own path and not trying to necessarily do what somebody else did. Although
sure.
you can get ideas from other people. You were
Yes.
talking earlier about networking, and that's definitely one thing that a lot of technical people, a lot of writers, they don't really want to network. They just want to do their thing. But the cool thing about networking is you're interacting with people who are just like you. And
Mm,
so it's always fun. It's always good. I love going to writer conferences and talking about writing and science and space and things like that. How can you go
that's
wrong?
cool. Well, I'm sure people love hearing from you too. You've been in this a long time and definitely have, the accolades to show. I'm glad you said that. Writing is such a solo adventure. You're just grinding at it every day, each day. And like your family comes in around you and comes in and out of the picture or office, or you go somewhere and
Yeah,
when you have your peers and you have colleagues or maybe sometimes groups that support you, what a joy and what a privilege because it's such a quietly humbling solo adventure for doing the writing. And
yeah.
I'm just starting. I'm just on the front end. So I can only imagine once you find what works for you, how do you step out and get reengaged? Did you get to go to Space Force and go? get inspired and see anything that you can share behind the scenes?
I didn't, but I am a member of the National Space Society, and I do go on tours
Oh,
sometimes that they arrange. So, for example,
yes.
right now in space, as part of the International Space Station, there is the Bishop airlock, which I have touched with my hands. Of course, I
Awesome.
was wearing a Tyvek suit from head to toe,
Yeah.
and I don't know why they let me touch it, but that was cool. We got to see that. I got to reach my hand inside. That was at Nanorex, south
Oh,
of
cool.
Houston, and I got to reach my hand inside a CubeSat deploying mechanism, which was very
Oh, that's
cool.
cool.
About the
Oh,
size
see?
of a possum trap.
Oh my gosh. That's so
but
cool.
but yeah, I mean, you get opportunities like that from knowing other people. Um,
You
so
bet.
there you go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so walk us through now the this anthology. So you're requested to write it. And how do you begin? Where does one start?
Well, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to kind of follow the analog magazine model of having fiction and fact, because kind of the point was to have fact articles telling the history of the Space Force and dispelling misconceptions about it. So most of those I had already written about. I already had some ideas of what I wanted to say. So I wrote most of those. But then going back to the networking theme, I had met William Otto, who was the head of space laser research for the SDI program back in the 80s. And he
Oh,
agreed to write a forward for me. So I'm like, okay,
nice.
I will take you up on that.
Very
And
nice.
then I reached out to um, other people that I knew. Of course, you for an anthology, you always want to have um, big names on the cover. So I know Larry Niven and David Bren, and I don't think I had met the Benford brothers in person, but I was able to get hold of them. So Greg and Doug Benford wrote a story for us, and basically the
We are
idea
breaking up
for
again.
the
We are
whole
breaking up again.
anthology is science fiction stories and fact art straight about Steve Kerr. Okay,
Yeah,
did
right after the networking.
right.
Power of networking.
The power of networking. So the idea behind the anthology is science fiction stories and fact articles illustrating the need for the Space Force and dispelling public misconceptions about it. Um, so some of the fact articles I kind of already knew what I wanted to write, and I had already kind of written and done some basic research in planning for the anthology. But the big thing is I needed stories to go into it. Well, because I'm a Writers of the Future winner and I know people, I know Larry Niven, I know David Brin. I was able to get hold of several other people who are very prominent, make good big names to go on the cover, including um, the Benford brothers, who are well known in the scientific circles. So I reached out to them, um, and I had met through my science writing on Quora, I had met Bill Otto, who was the head of the Space Laser research program under the
Okay.
Strategic Defense Initiative back in the 1980s, and he agreed to do a forward for me. So that was awesome. And then you send out a call first to your friends, people who you know can deliver a good story, and then to the general, to the universe, everybody send me a story. The hardest part of this was writing the writer guidelines, because I wanted the stories to illustrate why we need space defense. So I didn't want a bunch of really out there alien invasion, magical thinking stories. But on the other hand, you don't want to constrain your authors too much. So what we ended up doing is the stories kind of start being more down to earth, practical, near future, what the Space Force might actually do. And then they get more speculative as we go on.
Ooh,
and that worked out really well.
open up the
Um,
imaginations of everyone.
that's what I hope. Yes.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, what story surprised you? What, either because it was like a possibility of a true future or something that was like, this is nothing anyone ever thought of. Love it.
You, actually, one of the stories that surprised me the most was one where I don't want to give too much away, but there's foreign agents who are exploiting space resources to cause car crashes, but not by hacking the cars, basically by hacking the people driving the cars and tricking the
Interesting.
people into taking control of the cars so that they can be hacked because the cars would keep them safe if they were driving themselves. It was very multi-layered.
Oh,
Um,
oh. Was the main character Siri or Alexa?
it was sort of like that,
Just kidding.
but
You know that old GIF or that old meme, turn left and they end up in the lake or the pond because they
yeah,
just keep listening to
yeah,
the car.
it was very much like that. Only you end up driving over a cliff, and then it makes it
No.
very hard to investigate what happened to you.
And then the story's
Um,
done. Come on.
yeah,
No. It
yeah,
just, well, that's interesting. That is an
that
interesting.
was fun. My the I wrote a story for this anthology. I don't know if you know or not, but for the last like 11 years, I've submitted stories to the Jim Bain Award contest every year,
Okay.
because they're very much up my alley. They're looking for near future kind of realistic space exploration stories. So all of my open source space stories about people doing like Apollo reenactor flights and
Oh,
things like new rocket engines, they've all gone to the contest, finaled, not won the grand prize, and then sold to Analog Magazine. So the story that I was going to submit last year is called A Fair Defense. And it's about a little girl whose science fair project is nationalized to protect the GPS constellation of satellites
oh my.
because somebody is taking them out. And that might sound ridiculous, and it is, but what's not ridiculous is things like that have actually happened. That was one of the things that I found in doing research for this anthology is there have already been cases, one that we know of through unclassified sources, where Russia has launched spacecraft that have approached our reconnaissance satellites close enough that they've moved to get away from
Right.
it.
Oh boy.
And that's one of the reasons they created the Space Force. Anybody who thinks, oh, this is some wild idea from a bunch, saber rattling or things like that. No, no, it's not.
Right.
Um,
Look
the
at what has
satellites,
happened.
the
Go ahead.
satellites that are in orbit, even if you discount military uses, they're worth close to $1 trillion a year
Yeah.
in their impact on the economy. And if somebody starts taking out, if you take out more than about 5 GPS satellites, the constellation stops working correctly.
Sure.
And if the constellation stops working correctly, well, to begin with, it affects banking because banking transactions use the timing signals as part of their cryptography. So it really does affect down to earth things. And then you have people who are like, I don't want to give money to the military. It's just the military. Well, okay, nobody likes war, but remember, in World War II, when you wanted to accomplish a military objective, you bombed a city. Now you drop a bomb through a window and hit the person you're actually trying to hit. And that's made possible because of GPS. So everybody wants GPS satellites to be reliable, even especially people who hate war.
Yeah. Yeah. What a story idea. And there it is, future forward, thinking
Yeah.
about how we already are using them or the potential for their use and how we can use them in the future. I love that you put one of the characters as, I'm assuming, the hero as the young lady. So,
Yes.
okay, cool. Love it. And not so far in the future, I hope. But look how far we've come. You were talking about technology and how we're going to use it. And I had heard something astounding the other day, and it actually had nothing to do with our topic or our industry, which is space exploration and writing and stories. It was about diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And but we can apply this technology to us that in the last 50 to 100 years, diabetes has become so prevalent, and it has evolved, and it has just gone so completely crazy that we can't always keep up with this as it's moving so quickly. And at first, it wasn't even terribly a concern. Then it was a concern. Then it was trying to be government intervened and regulated and trying to, help with sugar. And we all know that story and things. And now it's here we are. And it's almost like things are happening too fast for us to either control it, to work it, to apply the technologies. We have now medication, but it's everything is going so fast. We have, as a human species, gone from like insulin regulation to not capable of insulin regulation in the last 50 years. And we know why, mass producing, food and sugar and all kinds of other environmental things.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's definitely that way with the space industry. So some of these stories that you're speaking of, even though they might sound astounding or very futuristic, you're thinking, but wait, there's people in our lives and in our families that were just flying on planes for the first time not long ago, for the first time. And if you remember, you were probably a young kid, and now babies and parents of people of all ages fly on planes as if we've always done it. And things are moving quickly. So I like this premise.
It is amazing to think when my grandmother was born into a world in which probably fewer than a dozen people had ever flown in the entire world. Only rich people had mechanical means of transportation. Everybody else rode on horses. That was my grandmother. And she died in a world in which people had walked on the moon
Ah, amazing.
and actually lived for years in the International Space Station. So yeah, it is really amazing. And I'll never forget one of the things that Peter told me at the ISDC when we met is, we don't need a space force to send Marines into space. That's not what the idea is about. It's mostly to protect the satellites, at least for now. But wherever people go, the military and the law have to follow. So just
Mm,
like you need the Coast Guard
sure.
in order to enforce international law, you're going to need some mechanism to enforce laws in space. And it goes back to what I always say about science fiction. In the early days of science fiction, a lot of the stories were really about technology, about this really cool thing that somebody figured out. But those didn't make good stories. What makes good stories is people. It's been said that a story is about a character who wants something and can't get it and tries repeatedly to get it and ultimately either succeeds or fails.
Yes.
And if you think about it, that's true of a lot of other things in life other than stories, right?
Sure.
That's
Yeah.
when I was in school, we had a class. I had an economics class, and the subtitle on the textbook was "An Economic History of the United States." And I hated the teacher. The teacher was terrible, but the book was fantastic because what I realized was none of the battles, General Grant's horse's name, and all that nonsense that we have to learn. None of that stuff's
Mhm.
important. What's important is why did we fight all those wars? And the answer in almost every case was economics. And behind
Yeah.
the economics is individual people who wanted things, couldn't have them, tried repeatedly to get them. What
Yeah.
does that sound like?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm thinking about Dune,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'm thinking about resource fighting, interplanetary resource science fiction stories of who has resources that are needed and trading them and acquiring them and seeking them out. Yeah, of course.
absolutely.
What resources in the future, other than protecting our own planet, do you see us? I mean, obviously, atmosphere, water, we need that for sure. Do you see or do you enjoy thinking of implementing in your stories some kind of not yet discovered resource or something like, new to humans or something perhaps familiar that has a new application?
Well, the difficulty with writing realistic science fiction that's beyond very near term is exactly that issue because when you start talking about like having colonies on other planets and things like that, you have to have an economic reason to do it that's greater than the cost of doing it. And I used to joke that as a kid I watched 2001. I'm like, wow, this is this amazing movie. And as an adult, I watch it. I'm like, who's paying for that moon base? My God, that door alone must cost $1 trillion, right?
So true.
So it is difficult, and you know you've got Elon Musk saying he wants to go to Mars, and apparently he thinks building big rockets are the hard part of doing that, and that's not the hard
Right.
part. The
Right.
hard part is, and the hard part is not even keeping people alive and growing food and creating rocket food on Mars. The hard part is setting up an economy where it isn't just a colony that's forever beholden to Earth.
Mm.
That's very much harder. So as a writer, you have to either assume that certain things have happened, or you have to decide what direction you're going to go.
Yeah.
But in the more immediate future, there are so many things around Earth that space can help with. Today, space is used for managing natural resources, tracking what's happening with groundwater. It's used in petroleum exploration. It's used in every kind of logistics, from oil tankers to getting pizza delivered to your door.
That's true.
And
How did we do
then
these things before?
right.
Honestly.
Well, and a lot of things we can't do without the computer anymore, right? Because
Yeah.
the whole economy has molded to it. And then you look at energy, and energy is kind of the big the the elephant in the room. No matter what near term future you see for humanity, because even if, no matter what you believe or don't believe about climate change, the reality is we're going to run out of fossil fuels over the next few centuries at most. That's a given. And if you don't believe that, I can let you talk to the head of Dutch Royal, the North America, what was it, Northern Hemisphere head of drilling for Dutch Royal Shell, who said exactly that to my wife at a meeting a few years back. He said that in the first century, we drilled all the easy oil, and now we're drilling all the hard oil. And in another century, it'll be gone, and there isn't any more. So that brings in, do we turn to nuclear? Well, that has strengths and weaknesses. Do we turn to solar, wind, hydro? Do we want to bring in space solar, which has its own problems? But there's lots of fascinating topics to be explored, and lots of stories that can be
Mhm.
um,
I
written
love it.
about
And
those
this is
topics.
and this is the power of story that I love, because the way you might problem solve for that in your story or through your characters is one way. And I know you say there's always that challenge with near term fiction, but someone could see that and say, well, let's try it. Who knows? Or someone can read that and say, why can't we apply that? Well, it's science fiction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
So Disney
absolutely,
decided to put a theme park in a swamp. And until it was done, everyone was like, you're crazy. That's insane. And
that's
then they did
exactly
it.
right.
So
Yeah,
so it's kind of like, and that's near term too. He wasn't like, hey, in the long future, when the earth allows us to excavate it enough where we can put a huge park there, we should have a long term strategic. He's like, we have a year and then we're going to open a theme park. How can we do this? And just figure it out. So when you write these, energy seems to be one of the themes. Let's talk a little bit about characters and humanity too, because as humans, where you're writing for humans to read. And so we're really reading about ourselves, right? And how we're going to survive or thrive or explore or continue or I don't know, hopefully evolve to see where we're going to be at in the next 100 years. So let's talk about how you find the inspiration there and even get back into Space Force, because I bet you have had such visionaries and the people at Space Force currently and maybe back at the time who are envisioning this new branch of government had to be strategic and yet also visionary, because they had to plan for things that were not even yet in orbit. And or they had to problem solve for things that were not yet problems that were going to become problems, like let's say orbital debris, or like you mentioned, spy satellites interacting with other satellites, losing orbit, and et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about some of those people as we circle back to Space Force too, and your interactions with them.
Well, one of the things that I did in seeking stories was I talked to Arlen Andrews, who I know through my network, and he's a member of a think tank of mostly science fiction writers, but also scientists who consult for the government on all these kind of issues. And I think
Really?
it's very interesting because
What a
it
job.
is true that writing, I think the idea that science fiction predicts the future is kind of oversold sometimes, just like saying that NASA invented Velcro and everything else new and wonderful is oversold. But there's some truth to it too. Uh, Perfect example is a story I just sold to Analog is called How Greenpeace Invented the Death Ray. And
Oh,
it's a joke which you get if you read the story, but it's about a company that is building these orbital space solar towers. And if you do some research on space solar, you can kind of see what are the problems, and you're going to lose a lot. You're going to have to transmit the power down to the ground, and you're not really going to create a death ray, but you have issues because of that. The power is spread out, so the antenna has to be very large, and that increases the cost, and blah blah blah.
yes, we're talking
Well,
about solar power from space, but
exa-
harvest back to Earth, right?
and exactly,
Okay.
and power that never is interfered with by weather, right? It's
Right,
24 hours
right.
a day. Um, and so what I came up with is instead of putting a really huge satellite way out in space and requiring I would say impractically large antenna to pick up the power, you put a series of satellites in a lower orbit and you make them steerable so that they can beam power as they pass over customers that are under their ground track, right? So the story is about how people use different technologies that in the real world may or may not be applicable to that kind of problem, but to make it where you can have more customers as your satellites pass overhead. And then, of course, somebody hacks into the satellites. And because they've solved this problem of controlling the beam and narrowing the beam, now they can kind of use it as a death ray. But it's not really a death ray, but it's dangerous. It can hurt. Like if you
Right?
shine it at a school or a refinery, that would not be good.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that. But then in the course of writing the story, I realized, oh, there is a need that the real world Space Force absolutely 100% for sure needs, and I hope they know this. They need to be able to get people into space with like just a handful of hours notice in something. Because what if somebody did something like that? You're not going to have anything in space that can handle it. You're going to have to get people on, you're going to have to be able to get astronauts on site rapidly. And so what I came up with is the same solution that they came up with for the ballistic missiles back in the 60s. You need a simple solid fuel rocket sitting in a warehouse out at Vandenberg Space Force Base that you can get prepped and put people on it with tools and launch them within 24 hours. And I hope they read the story because I think they should really have that.
One solution. You got that. I love
Yeah.
that. And it's not, gosh, have you proposed that to Boeing Starliner team?
Yeah, that's a whole other topic we
Don't
could
touch
talk
it.
about
Don't touch
Boeing
it.
right now.
So
I
we're
hope.
recording this in August. This will go a couple weeks from now, but I let's just hope and pray that they're coming back safe. I know there's plenty of workarounds on that, but you bring up a very serious, needed. You're right. Absolutely 100%. We're going to need a workforce that's going to be space accessible, and that doesn't even exist yet. So,
Yeah. So
challenge
all
accepted.
kinds of ideas and coming up
Yeah.
with stories is a good way to explore ideas. It
How
always has
fun
been.
though.
So
How fun. Yes, I like that you did this. And as we're going to conferences, I need to get to yours, the ISDC. I've been wanting to for years. Some of the conferences I've been going to are really going to start focusing on the blue collar. workers of space to start the assembly and the hard, tangible building of the things we're going to need as we explore. So, again, not so far distant future when you're talking about these characters and these people
Yep.
within our stories. And Stuart, I think more than ever now, people who are reading these stories and absorbing and enjoying your stories and science fiction stories in general, they're making that connection. It's not men on Mars and little cartoon characters in the near and a long distant future of one day or possibly someday. I think that was more our generation where we were told, and I don't know about you, and I'm still want my money back, that we would have flying cars and that all of us would be astronauts by now. And I don't know about you, but I don't have a flying car and I haven't been anywhere off planet yet. So it might not be our generations, but it may very well be the next. And as they, enjoy your writing and the science fiction writing, you're putting these solution problems out there for characters to resolve. And so I think they're I think people are thinking along the same lines of like not so distant future, but perhaps if I go to school or if I get certified in welding or if I get certified in blue collar activity, there could be a future role for me in space.
That is absolutely true. And my friend Martin L. Shoemaker, he writes stories that are set in what he calls the blue collar space universe. And that's like I have open source space and he has blue collar space. And it's the same kind of idea. It's space becoming more accessible to more and more people. Obviously, there's still a lot of money involved, a lot of industry involved, but it is going to involve more people. And I think one of the reasons that there was not as much support for the space program back in kind of post Apollo and the Skylab and into through the space shuttle era is because it was so far removed from everyday people. But now you see what SpaceX and increasingly Blue Origin and Sierra Nevada are doing, and you see I think there's like 2,300 companies that are supporting this new commercialization of space, and so people see little snippets of that. And there are more jobs related to space and there are more impacts related to space. And I think people start to see it more as something that's part of their life. It's kind of like if you went back to, I don't know, colonial Williamsburg and you talk to people about Germany, they'd say, well, that's where my ancestors came from and we will never go back, right? But now I have coworkers who go home to India for 6 weeks every year to see their family. It's not a big deal. Just buy a ticket
Isn't
and
that
go.
amazing? Amazing.
And that's what technology does for you.
And the one thing that I say you and I both, but especially you, is you are our navigator. You are the provider of the words that influence and inspire and tell the story. And I think I want to go back to what you said about Sputnik and the early, the late 60s, I suppose, drop off in space enthusiasm was there just weren't these compelling connective stories. Journalists used to be our navigators where they would give us access to the glorious original seven and who they are and the humans and their lifestyle and the Corvettes and the living the life, right? And the fighter pilots and the
Yeah.
whole thing. And while, yes, they were journalists, they were also the storytellers. They were telling us about the next mission, the goals, where they were going, who was going, what's the mission rocket. So now we can barely keep up. I mean, I would love to be a space journalist, but I'd feel actually overwhelmed because how do you possibly keep up as this grows and grows so quickly? But as storytellers, we're still that gateway for many because I don't know how you feel so tied to this. I know you've stepped outside the genre and outside of space exploration writing, but yeah, and you do a beautiful job connecting, but sometimes we have to bring the reader along to remind them there's still a space station that orbits. There's no longer a space shuttle. And so a lot of people, as much as they are connected, especially to the technology that space brings us, like GPS you mentioned and the others, they're still a little unaware or perhaps uninformed on the how or the what. And how could they possibly keep track? But it's our job, whether it's through a narrative or a story or reporting or a fictional work piece, to help guide that. And I love that you do that. Um, what a profession we have to do this.
I agree absolutely, and it's funny because when I was in Chicago, Trevor Quattree, the editor of Analog, took me to lunch, and he said, "You know why I buy your stories? Because they have hope." And
Oh,
I like to hear that. It's become very fashionable today to make everything be a dystopia, and I get that. You know, it's you create bigger problems for your characters and
mm,
sometimes more fantastical worlds. But I do think it's important to do what literature has long done, to remind people that no matter what happens to us, we are an amazing species that can do amazing things if we just have hope.
thank you. Thank you for giving us hope. Honestly, I love that when writers do that and we do have that, you've got to. I mean, and yet, I want to remind everyone if you think you really want to go and live in space, it is not easy. This is not easy. And it should be hopeful. We should go explore. But I like that he takes you to lunch and reminds you of that because some of these you watch Dune and you leave like heavy hearted. You're like, oh, we've been chasing a resource for 2 hours on the beautiful cinematic experience, and
Yeah,
I feel overwhelmed. Um, so maybe that might be our future, but at least right now it's still pretty exciting. We're discovering things all the time, perhaps some biosignatures or technosignatures on exoplanets. I mean, this is not tomorrow. This is now. James
it
Webb Space
yeah.
Telescope, things we're going to build and do in space. We are amazing, Stuart. I love it.
You know, I said in I think it was my first open source space story that the Apollo program was the single most important event in human history, specifically because we didn't get anything out of it. I mean, it was a Cold War battle. You could look at it that way, and it was national pride, and you could look at it that way. But more than anything else, it was millions, 400,000 people worked together to do something that millions of people had imagined for thousands of years as being completely impossible. And we kind of collectively looked up and said, we actually could go to the moon.
Mm.
And nobody said, why would you do that? We did it. And you know, you can say what you want about Elon Musk, and I know people will in the comments, but look at what he has built.
Yeah,
It is right up there amongst the greatest achievements of in human history. And I don't know what he's going to use it for, but it's going to be amazing.
right. Right. And it takes us to showcase it. I mean, these days anyone can turn on a phone and record, and there's been a lot of Starlink sightings and things, but there's still a lot of people who don't understand what Starlink is, or
Yeah.
Starship, or his mission, or why he wants us to get to Mars. I mean, he is profoundly and passionately, almost, almost psychotically trying to get humanity to Mars, and he has his
Let's call
reasons.
it evangelically.
Okay. Fill in the blank, however we want to call it. Um, but he has some incredible reasons why he wants us to be a multi-planet species. We have to start somewhere. And, we've done the moon and we need to be able to survive outside of this planet in order to continue to evolve. Because I don't know about you, but as I've had some wonderful guests on, I'm learning about this search for life question and how we might be asking the wrong question, or we might be searching for the wrong life
Hmm.
as we know it, perhaps not necessarily the way we think of life. And as the Drake equation and all the things that get presented to answer the question, it's amazing to just stop for a moment and think life has been on our planet for an awfully long time, and then it ended, and then it started again, and then it ended, and then it started again. I have been this many years old, Stuart, where I'm like, wait, what? Go back. It ended, and then it started again, many times over, millions of times over. And my brain sometimes needs to remember that, and remember that we are just like you said earlier, the humanity of us is just a blip in the long experiment of this earth. And we've got a long way to go.
And left to its own devices, all life on Earth will come to an end finally, unless we humans, we are the only species that has ever been here that can say, we can prevent that.
There's the
And
hopeful. There it is that you write. Yep.
people sometimes talk about the seminal moment of kind of modern times as being the Apollo 8 flight when they turned the camera back and took a picture of Earth from the moon, from lunar orbit for the first time. And for the first time, you see the abode of life in one picture frame, everyone who's ever lived except the guy holding the camera, right? Um, but there's a more practical tie-in too. For people who say, why are we spending all this money on space? They should consider that it was an experimental satellite launched in the 1970s to do Earth observation just to see how that would work before we had all these weather satellites and everything that we have today. That found the thinning of the stratospheric ozone layer that we call the ozone hole. And they went back and they looked at scientific papers that had been published 10 or 15 years earlier that said, hey, we're pumping out these chlorinated and bromated fluorocarbons and they're completely non-reactive and eventually they're going to build up into the atmosphere and here's what's going to happen. And lo and behold, the satellite discovered that it's happening and it created this flurry of activity. And within 10 years, they signed the Montreal protocols and essentially banned CFCs and BFCs. Everybody knows that. What most people don't know is that 2 years ago, a study came out looking at what would have happened had we not done that. And what would have happened is by now, that annual thinning of the ozone hole would be reaching close to the equator each year. And it would be killing crops on a huge scale. And very likely, we would be fighting World War III over food today. And all that was averted because we launched a satellite into space, not knowing what we were going to do with it.
Thank you, satellite. Thank you, humans. Thinking forward. Yes, what a great case study. I'm sure George and Star Wars team would say, I agree with you. That's why we made whole movie series about the robots.
Yeah,
The
there you go.
robots will save us. We'll send them first. Let's
Yeah,
go back to Space Force, excuse me. So you were ahead of something as you are often, Stuart, before it came into fruition. So you talked a little bit about the pushback, and you talked a little bit about people saying it was military focused, or well, this is going to be a joke, or what have you. Did you happen to see the Netflix spin-off parody on Space
I
Force too?
did. I did. I actually, as a military brat myself, I liked this series. I actually thought it was relatively, for a comedy, it was pretty respectful of military culture.
I loved
I
it.
tell people though, there was and they actually had some consultants from the space defense. I know you might not get that from watching the show, but there was an episode of Space Force where they launched the satellite and a Chinese satellite comes up with these big kind of clippers and clips off the solar panels. You remember that? And it's a big joke and it's big silly until you learn that the Chinese actually have launched a satellite that is believed to have the ability to do essentially that. And they say it's to do in orbit repair, but
Sure.
everybody in the defense community says, yeah, we don't think so.
Yes. See? So here we are, art imitating life, imitating art.
Exactly. And
Eh,
have a good laugh out of it. It's fine.
Yeah. I love that series, that whole series. And so you're military former, and I'm a former NASA. So I loved how dry and people really think there's some secret sauce or hidden something at NASA. There's not. Um, what
No.
what they think people see on TV is really called backlighting. That's what they see. And it's a trick, when you go on
That's right.
camera, you put like the pink light here and the purple light there. And then, or people think Mission Control has like these, it's super dark and then it's super, generated with all the lights and the buttons and the projections. It's not. It's not. It's screens with consoles,
Yeah.
but it's not.
It's computers sitting on a desk.
Your
To
office
be
looks a little more
clear,
vibrant,
there you go.
honestly, Stuart, than Mission Control, to be honest.
To be clear, I am not. former military, but my father was a
Your family.
B-52 radar navigator, and so
Wow.
I identified in Space Force with the relationship between him and his daughter
Oh, I
because
see.
they're getting moved to a new base and it's uprooting her life. And of course, we had some of that. And
Sure.
also, I can remember being in at Ellsworth, we had garden plots. And I can remember being in the garden when the siren went off and the looks that the airmen exchanged with their wives because they didn't know if it was just a drill or World War III starting out, and
Wow.
that makes an impression on you. And it's related to the Space Force because the Space Force is about 9,000 service personnel and a few thousand contractors, most of whom are going to have desk jobs in the United States. Right? They're not building Battlestar Galactica in space, but just like the Cold War was fought as almost as much by the families who were affected. These people all have families too, and
Sure.
I just felt like they deserve better than to be the butt of people's jokes on Twitter.
Yeah.
No offense to George Takei, you're awesome.
I agree. No, I agree. And it's through writing about it, showcasing it, that people will learn.
Exactly.
So I remember being in New York working for NASA, and we were celebrating the 50th, yeah, I think the 50th anniversary of wait, let me get this right. The sesquicentennial of flight. I think, is that right? And people were coming through the exhibit, and we were right outside Rockefeller Plaza, and NASA had this exhibit, and I was out there working it. And because I was just NASA representative with the shirt and the logo, they would come up and ask me questions that were astounding. And these are American people who, citizens who have access to news and information more so than most, right? Most countries. And they were like, what, we're still, are we still going back to the, are we still going to the moon? Are we still landing on the moon? What do you mean we have a space station? You mean that first one or the second one? I mean,
Uh,
and it was interesting. Um, so I was always playing a little bit of catch up. And so I wonder if you have seen, now that you've written about it and helped create this information, do you think Space Force rolled out the way they intended? Do you think they're presenting themselves now? And
no.
how
Uh,
so? What do you mean?
look. It's uh, it's hard for bureaucracies to change. We all know that. I will tell you that one of the reasons there's not more involvement on the Space Force. Now, I will say, I did finally get hold of the Department of Defense PR office, who were very helpful in getting me in touch with the ladies at the Air Force Uniform Office who actually created the new uniform. I did an
Oh,
interview with them. It was fantastic, but that was late in the game. In the 2 years leading up to that, it was call this person and be redirected to this person who's no longer in that job because their post has been closed and they've moved to New York. And they're like,
uh,
oh my God, it was just insane. But that's because they were part of the reason for creating the Space Force is that you already had 9,000 people supporting space defense, but they were scattered through every part of the military, and some of them not even in the military. And so they were,
they weren't
it's
organized.
they weren't organized, which was kind of the
Yeah,
whole point.
yeah.
So now they are, and hopefully they have a more coherent lock on their PR message. They need people like you doing their PR for.
Hey,
Just gonna say,
Stuart, are you listening, Space Force? Beth is available. Beth and Stuart are available for both writing and PR.
that's
Um,
right.
you know what? We're actually going to have, in just 2 weeks, we're going to have Colonel Heather Bogstye from Space Force on the podcast. What should I
Oh
ask her?
yes.
Now, the reason we're connecting with her, which don't even get me started, the way you had to back in the day before they were truly established, I can't imagine the hoops you had to jump through and how you did your research. It must have been exhausting again. Oh, but I'm sorry, this all happened overnight. Forgive me. That was a joke. I know you've worked so hard and long on this, but same with me, just to speak with Colonel Bogstye because she and I have a mutual connection in space camp. She's a space camp alumni, and as am I. And I sit on the board, and she was recently honored into the Space Camp Alumni Hall of Fame. So that was the connection that got her to say yes to the podcast. And it wasn't so much that she did not say yes or no, it was her team, right? So now they're so protected that they're like, I'm not kidding you when I say I had to fill out 5 pages of an application to have her join me on the show. And rightfully so. She's a colonel in Space Force. So what should I ask her? What would you like to have answered if possible?
Um, Honestly, the same kind of things that you asked me. I think, okay, you should obviously have me on to talk with her about the
Okay.
anthology and talk and talk about the uniform and the insignia and all those kind of things. Um, but honestly, I would ask her about what the people are doing, because I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I'm not completely satisfied with how we handled in the anthology is people thinking, oh, the military is just going to waste billions of dollars building space stations and sending troops into space. And I'm like, no, no. I mean, they will if they have to eventually one day, but in the near future, it's people. Um, I'll give you a perfect example. They're building the let me say this right, a optical interferometry telescope at Magdalena Ridge, which is an optical telescope with enough resolution. I think they had this in the Netflix series too, that you will be able to read the serial numbers off of satellites in low Earth orbit.
Nice.
Now, what do you
Necessary
do with
too.
that? What do you do with that information? Well, if you see a piece of hardware where it shouldn't be doing
The
something that it
moon,
shouldn't,
like
you
the moon.
send people to deal with them on
Uh-huh.
Earth, right?
Uh-huh.
Not send up a rocket and create more debris in orbit. So I think that kind of question about the difference between people think, oh, we're bringing war to space, and how the Space Force actually is. The idea that the Space Force was created to militarize space is exactly backwards. Space was militarized in 1958, and the Space
Mhm.
Force is there to keep it from filling up with debris, to put it
Yeah, yeah.
bluntly.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay, join me. Why not? I'll send you all this stuff after we're done here.
I'd
I'll let you
be
know
happy
when
to.
and where. But then I'll have to I'll have to write out another page adding you and they'll have to approve it and the whole thing.
I
Uh
was going to say I filled out one of those forms, and now to their credit, I will say the Pentagon, if you're doing a movie or a book or anything like that, and you need access to military facilities, and you can fill out all the paperwork, they're very accommodating in theory.
in
I
theory.
filled out all of that stuff to get permission to just reproduce their. I wanted to use the logo on the cover, and after all that and like months of negotiations, you're like, no, you can't do that.
But you tried. Good for you. Good for you. I love talking to you, Stuart. This is fun. I will be asking her that. I
And
will be asking her other questions too, like our role. And when I say our, how, she's amazing. She's got some incredible history. And people want to know that pathway. It's a new pathway. It's very new. I don't know anyone else. I don't know any females, especially at that level at Space Force. So we'll be fascinated by that. But Stuart, what is knowing that? What is that if no one knows about it? Right? If
right.
women don't know that there's a Colonel Heather Bogstye, then okay, that's nice, but I would hope that she would see us as stewards who walk alongside and help to enhance the narrative of Space Force. Just like there's people who do that for NASA, the Air Force, the military, the Coast Guard, and so on and so on. Whether it's fiction or narratives or hardcore journalism. What do they say?
Absolutely.
Any coverage is good coverage.
Any coverage as well. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but most coverage is good coverage. Um, she's not alone. I tried to get hold of Deanna Burt, who's a general at the Space Force. So they do have and of course, it shouldn't be surprising because the Air Force is the most friendly to females of any group.
Mm.
But on that topic, let me tell you, my interview with Tracy Roan at the Air Force Uniform Office was sort hilarious and fascinating for
Yeah.
talking to people who are very serious about their work. The uniform for the Space first uniform in America, probably in all that was designed to fit women first.
Finally.
Now, I probably don't have to tell you why that makes sense, but for my male author listeners, I will explain. The female body is a lot more variable than the male body. It's just as
What?
simple as that. If you make a uniform that fits the range of women and doesn't put pockets in inconvenient places or what have you, it'll fit men. It's no problem. And women in the military have been putting up with uniforms that didn't fit for forever. My wife did when she was in the Army Reserves. Um, so yeah, they
Yeah.
created a uniform that was sleek, iconic, and modern. And I think they did a very
Nice.
fine job.
And functional, please.
Yes.
Please. Yes, finally. Finally. What, that only took 50 years? 150 years? Okay, great. I'm glad we've arrived. Um,
Now, if
where can
only
people
NASA will do the same thing for the spacesuits, then we'll be in good shape.
maybe not NASA, but yes, eventually NASA. Let me say it that way. Eventually NASA, yes. I've seen so many wonderful, innovative ideas from entrepreneurs, Stuart, not necessarily, the big companies, although the SpaceX suits and the new Axiom suits, phenomenal, look great, look
Yep.
sleek, function great. Um,
We'll
but I
see.
think entrepreneurs are coming to the table and saying, and what about this fabric or what about
Yep.
this cost or weight? Okay, where can people find all these amazing articles and some of these interviews that you've had and you sat down with?
So, Tales of the United States Space Force was published in June by Bain Books. It's available through all major retailers. And if you just Google it, you'll find the Simon and Schuster page that has a link to your favorite bookstore. And if you want to know more about me, you can go to my website, cstuarthardwick.com, or you can come see me at ArmadilloCon in September, or at the IDSC back in Orlando this
Oh,
coming year, where I hope I will see you, Beth.
yes, I would love to. And hopefully, let me see how if I get started on that paperwork so you can join us and do some Space Force talking with Colonel Heather. And in the meantime, Stuart, I really thank you for your time. Thank you for always sharing your latest and greatest. What's next? Anything you can share on the horizon we can watch for? So we have you back in the show a lot sooner than a year and a half.
I have some news that I can't release yet, so I'm
Oh,
just going to say I'm going to be working on getting novels out so that I can support myself in my old age. Because I love short stories, but
you're not old.
they don't pay the bills.
Oh, you're not old, Stuart. No way. No way. And I do look forward to seeing you, whether it's back here on the show, please, at the conference in Orlando. That'll be my first time. So could you mentor me or help me go network with me a little? And it seems like you know everyone. So I'm going to stick with you.
Right back at you.
And I want to invite you as well. If you ever want to share one of your stories or a part of your story or a chapter on the stories of space, please do. We'd love to have you and point and showcase you and your work and launch it. We have a deadline coming up in October to launch from Canada, from the new spaceport, commercial spaceport out of Nova Scotia. So please feel free to send us anything you like, and we'd be honored to fly it.
Very cool, and I'm delighted to be part of this new space economy, entrepreneurship, whatever you want to call it, with you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, as more people get the book, I'm going to add it to our book club wish list of authors and stories that we're just getting back started again. Will you come back on and talk more about it with some questions from our listeners?
Absolutely, always a delight.
Perfect. All right. See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.